This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. As the Trump administration's trade offensive on China hits its fourth anniversary, who is paying the high price? Inflation in the United States reached record high, and history showed that inflation is always a key issue at the upcoming midterm election. So what is President Joe Biden's action plan? On Tuesday, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen held virtual talks amidst reports citing sources inside the White House that the Biden administration is considering reconfiguring some of the China tariffs. What is that supposed to mean? Is Biden merely window dressing the China trade issue? Can that actually improve China-U.S. relations? To discuss all this, Robert Hormats is joining me from New York City, a global finance leader and diplomat. Mr. Hormats is currently vice chairman of Kissinger Associates, an international consulting firm. Mr. Hormats is also a former Undersecretary of State who served 5 American presidents. Mr. Hormats, great to talk to you again. Welcome to the Hub on CGTN.
Well, it's great to be with you again. We've known one another for a long time, and it's great in this very difficult period to have this kind of communication.
You know what? It has been 4 years. Last time we met was on the Park Avenue in the Kissinger Associates office. And 4 years ago, there was no such thing as a trade war, or not a full-blown trade war. Look at what can happen in a span of 4 years' time. Let's talk about the issue of tariffs. What's your reaction based on the readouts from both Washington and Beijing?
Well, it's a bit hard to tell because the contents of the conversation have been kept very secret, but I think the issue is a relevant one, at least here, and I'm sure in China as well, because there are groups in the U.S. who favor a reduction in tariffs in general and tariffs to China as part of that to help reduce the rate of inflation in this country, which, as you know, is quite high, is also a factor in the midterm elections. So it's clearly an important issue. Whether there is enough agreement between the two countries and whether President Biden feels, given the strong criticism of China in the many American political circles, not all, but many, whether he, even if he wanted to for economic reasons, would politically be able to lower tariffs on Chinese goods.
On one hand, Joe Biden needs to look tough on China, the first order of business as U.S. president in the run-up to the election. And second of all, a U.S. president wants to look like he's doing something about inflation, and cutting China tariffs can be one of those means to achieve that. How will Joe Biden balance those two priorities? What's your prediction?
I think the feeling in Washington, and it's not easy to condense it into a few words, but I think the feeling in Washington is that it would be very difficult for him unilaterally to lower tariffs on Chinese products in the current political environment, even though it would probably help to deal to a degree with inflation. I don't think it's the answer to our inflationary problems. There are a whole lot of other issues that are contributing to inflation to a far greater degree than tariffs on Chinese goods, but it would certainly reduce inflation somewhat. But I think the feeling is that some progress needs to be made on issues relating to China or with China to give him political cover or a political argument as to why he lowered tariffs. It's hard for him to do it unilaterally without his being able to say China has done something to help to alleviate some of the tensions between the two countries.
But according to Politico, citing various sources inside the Biden administration, Biden is considering easing tariffs on some $10 billion worth of Chinese goods. And compare that against the $370 billion worth of goods on which Trump imposed tariffs. I mean, even if Joe Biden did do something about it, would that be merely window dressing the issue to perhaps ease inflation to make him look like a strong and tough president?
Well, it's a very good question. If you take the numbers that they've been talking about, and I don't believe that anyone really knows what the numbers are that they're considering. Clearly Janet Yellen is involved in these negotiations and within the White House and the administration. But it would be considered helpful, but the criticism he would get would be, one, there are people who, in fact, in Congress now who are pushing a bill to be even tougher toward China. And second, the argument would be that you're really not dealing with the root causes of inflation. So I think it would probably help him a little bit to say that he was lowering inflation, depending on the products, of course. But there would be those who say, well, what did you get from China? Trump imposed these to get some concessions from China. So the question to Biden will be, what did you get? That's one of the things he has to worry about. He's got, some say, do it to help inflation and help on the midterms, but there are others who say it'll hurt you in the midterms because you didn't get anything from China. So he's in the middle of a bind. So I suspect that if there were a discussion on this between Liu He and Secretary Yellen, there would be some talk, at least on her part, of what China might do to help alleviate some of these concerns. That would be my guess.
Mr. Hormats, you served at least 5 U.S. administrations in Washington, D.C. You served as the Undersecretary of State at the State Department. Help us understand the dynamics in Washington, the pressures, the competing forces that the sitting U.S. president faces. Because last time I checked, actually I checked it this morning, AFL-CIO, the largest labor union in the United States, is asking for an extension of those tariffs to protect American workers, such as steel workers. But on the other hand, you see some business communities, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is actively advocating for a exemption of those tariffs and the lowering of temperature. How are these different forces, competing forces work, in Washington?
Well, that's one of the problems that President Biden has at this point, whether he wants to annoy the AFL-CIO by lowering tariffs or do something for the business community and the Chamber of Commerce. And also, don't forget, he's got political forces in the Democratic Party who have a wide range of progressive voices who are arguing for tougher actions against China, not just for trade reasons, but they raise a lot of human rights issues. As you know, the progressives have made this a big issue. And then you have a number of people, not just the progressives, others as well. And then you have people. I just was with Senator Schumer over the weekend, and he and some of his colleagues would like a tougher set of measures on China with respect to tariffs and intellectual property and a whole range of things. So he's actually pushing his Democratic colleagues in the Senate and the House, but mostly in the Senate at this point, to impose tougher measures on China. So he's got not only the issue, as you correctly point out, between the AFL-CIO on one hand and the Chamber of Commerce and the business groups and a lot of economists who say that these tariffs really are paid largely by Americans and they won't eliminate inflation by any means. There are a lot of factors, I say, but it could tick it down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, both sides need to present the situation as a victory or at least a win-win situation. domestically. Let's talk about some economic issues, Mr. Hormats. We know the inflation in the United States, it may hit 8.6%, the highest in recent memory. How much do you think can cutting or slashing China tariffs help in terms of easing inflation in the United States? Because there are various forecasts and predictions out there.
It would help, certainly. I mean, lowering tariffs are a tax on the consumer for the most part. To the extent they're passed on by the importer to the consumer or the retailer to the consumer, they lower consumer price inflation. But there are lots of other factors. There are supply chain issues. More broadly, there's higher oil prices. Goods are in short supply because of COVID closings in China and COVID closings in various other parts of the world as well. And of course, there's been a lot of spending during the COVID period, which was needed, but a lot of that spending is still sort of in the hands of consumers, and now consumers are spending a lot of the money, a lot of the benefits they got. So it would certainly help to reduce tariffs with China somewhat, but if you were to ask whether it would have a very substantial impact on inflation, the answer is probably not, because there are so many other factors that are more significant as causes of inflation in the U.S.
Mr. Hormats, there are so many talks about so-called predatory non-market economic practices originating from China, the market access barriers, perceived or real, of China, that is being kept from foreign businesses. But I have some figures that I want to show to our Western friends and our international audience. Last year, foreign direct investment inflows totaled over $170 billion, a 20% increase year on year. That is according to the Ministry of Commerce. The number of foreign invested companies increased by more than 20% last year. What do you make of these figures?
I've always felt that China was going to continue to be a high growth country, even though its growth rate may not be the targeted 6%, maybe somewhat lower in the fives. It's still a country that's growing, particularly because of very substantial technological advances. I gave the keynote speech at the China Technology Conference in Shenzhen the last time I was in China, and was remarkably impressed by the kind of technology you see, AI and a whole range of other things. Clearly, there are companies that want to get into China, in part because of the China market, in part because of the technological advances, in part because China has a superb infrastructure network that has been built up over the years in the supply chains. I have to say that in the various conferences I've been to amongst American CEOs, they're becoming more concerned about investing in China, in part because they do make the point that some of their intellectual property is vulnerable, and they don't quite know what role the government is going to play in getting engaged in the economy, and could it do things in terms of regulatory measures that make it harder for foreign companies. So this is a reality that you hear when you talk to CEOs, as I do on a fairly regular basis. So these are real concerns by senior people.
Yeah, very true. Last month, I actually had the pleasure and privilege of hosting a panel discussion where Chinese Premier Li Keqiang met with the Chamber of Commerce people from Europe, from the United States, from Southeast Asia. We do hear a lot of course, praises, but also grievances, concerns from foreign companies, and chief among them, visa issues. And we do see some, modification from the Chinese side, slashing the quarantine time from 14 days to just 7, expediting visas, setting up grain channels, so-called grain channels for some foreign company representatives. And of course, the hope is there can be more and, more aggressive such measures going forward to facilitate foreign businesses and personnel from coming to the country. Mr. Hormats, finally, I want to ask you about U.S.-China relations more broadly. A couple of years ago, in an article in The Hill, you commented on the U.S.-China relations. You said the dispute between the two sides is not just about trade, and it won't be easy to resolve. Can you elaborate more on that, especially given what's happening recently in the past few months and years?
I think U.S.-China relationships, from my history, and I started in 1972 working on this when I was Kissinger's economic advisor in the White House. I was very optimistic. China, we hadn't had trade or investment for many decades, as you know, between our two countries. But I also think bringing China in the WTO made a lot of sense to bring China into the system. But I think that now relations are really not good. They're probably, from what I've seen, at least in my professional life, probably the worst that we've seen. They're a little better now. I wouldn't say the worst. They were probably worse under Trump because the rhetoric was so harsh. The rhetoric is not as harsh now, and that is at least a plus. And the second is that we are seeing these dialogues between the U.S. trade negotiator and Yellen, and all three are very accomplished people. But I just think that my worry is, and I regret this because I think it's the wrong direction, but I think the direction is toward more tensions and more differences, and the interaction between the two countries is just not good at this point. And therefore, I think we need to find some way of getting it back on track, because the potential for the two greatest powers on earth, and the two greatest scientific powers and the two greatest technological powers, is the opportunity is enormous. The other is that the technological issues tend to morph over or slide into military-related issues, because almost all the new technologies that we're developing and you're developing have enormous commercial benefit, but also many of them have potential benefits for military strength. And if we have more and more friction on the security side, on security issues, then the argument is, if China benefits technologically, that will help them economically, but it will also help them in terms of security strength. And I'm sure in Beijing, people say, well, if the Americans get advantage in certain areas, that'll help them on security issues as well. So we have to, so these things are all, they're not just trade and they're not just investment issues. They've morphed over, they've conjoined with security related issues, and that makes them much harder to deal with because of the level of suspicion and the level of mistrust that has developed over the last several years. I regret this because I've spent much of my career trying to improve relations between our two countries, and I would hope that a dialogue can be developed that will help to address these and alleviate, reduce, and to some extent, whatever is possible, eliminate some of these problems. But as I said in the article, it won't be easy. It'll be difficult. We need to try.
Of course, we do need
time. At high levels too. I mean, it can't, you got to have the technical people, but the high levels, and we have to deal with our legislatures. You're having the 20th Party Congress. We're having our midterm elections. We both have to engage our power structures at the top and then throughout.
Mr. Hormats, always great to pick your brain, and it's awesome to have you on our show. Come back again.
I'm flattered that you asked me, and always good. Communication is always good, and the difficult environment that we have should not prevent good communication between our two countries, and your show's helping to enhance that communication. So thank you.